Who can we compare gladiators with? Probably with wrestlers. Showiness, ostentation, a crazy crowd of fans, all are evident. Except that the result is not premeditated or is premeditated. Didn't Hollywood influence such an association? Let's try to figure it out. Gladiators for us are athletes in the arena, killing each other for the amusement of the public. But it was not always so. It all started with funerals. They preserved not just anyone, but the most prominent and wealthy aristocrats. Dances with tambourines, that is, the Battle of Gladiators, took place right over their graves. Well, not right in front of the corpse, but 9 days after the funeral. But still, why? In this way, the souls of the deceased were prepared for the upcoming afterlife. Allegedly, the spilled blood cleansed them. At some point, the dying began to leave a will, and games were held at their funerals. One of the noble Romans even wished that beautiful girls would fight in his honor. The first game in Rome, which we definitely know about, took place in 264 BC. The 3 pairs of gladiators fought on the Cattle Forum on the occasion of Brutus Pier's funeral. Over time, there were more and more gladiators. 22, 60, 74 pairs. In addition, the games began to be held not on the Cattle Forum, but on the Roman one. But the first one, for your understanding, is a trading square. It turned out to be something like street fights without rules. And the second, the center of cultural and political life in Rome. A time passed, and gladiator fights from the funeral rite turned into a mass spectacle. Moreover, they became a political tool by the time of the late Republic. The people were ready to support at elections the one who organized the most Hunger Games. In 66 BC, Julius Caesar, upon his appointment as aedile, promises to organize the most grandiose fights, putting forward 320 pairs of gladiators. The Senate, however, forbids him to do this, but Caesar is not lost. He put out fewer gladiators, but dressed them all in silver armor. As a result, the people still remembered these games. Using gladiators for their political purposes began so often that in 63 BC Cicero ordered the issuance of a law which prohibited a candidate for office, magistrates, from arranging gladiatorial games within 2 years before the elections. A peculiar day of silence for 2 years. However, no one could prohibit a private person from holding games under the pretext of commemorating their relative. In 22 BC, Octavian Augustus takes the games completely under state control. He was the adopted son of Julius Caesar and the first Roman emperor. Since then, one had to get permission to hold fights from the Senate. Octavian also regulates the types of gladiators, their weapons, and introduces the rules of fights. A surprise question. Were all gladiators slaves? Predominantly yes, slaves, prisoners of war, sentenced to death. But, drumroll, free people could also be gladiators. Some out of need, others in search of glory. Even members of the nobility entered the arena. In 57 BC, as many as 400 senators and 600 equestrians went out to fight. Sometimes even the emperors themselves took part in the battles. The most famous is Commodus, the very one from the movie Gladiator. He held more than 700 fights, and something tells us they were staged. In general, pure wrestling. In addition to gladiators, wild animals were also released into the arena. Initially, criminals sentenced to death were put against them. They were only given a spear for protection. Such a fight was essentially one of the types of executions. Later, this entertainment transformed into animal baiting venatio from Latin hunting. A special fully armed fighters venators appeared. They were assisted by bestiarii. The latter were something like today's beast tamers. They looked after them, provoked before the fight, and entertained the public with acrobatic tricks with dangerous animals. Venatio, fights with animals took place in the morning. The crowd was warmed up for the upcoming gladiatorial games. At noon, there was a break for spectacular and public executions, and after noon the very juice gladiatorial fights. They were called munus, in the plural munera, from the Latin obligation gift. Surprisingly, not only men and beasts fought in the arena, but even women, and this is proven. For example, a marble slab with their images found is kept in the British Museum. Women gladiators, however, were not taken seriously. They were needed again to warm up the crowd. The ladies, by the way, were probably dressed like gladiators, although they could possibly be naked. In our perception, the outcome of a gladiator's battle is always the same: the death of one of them. But this, as you probably guess, is the machinations of Hollywood, all for the epicness. Now think about it. A gladiator was raised and trained for years, and then lose a source of income and investment in a minute of battle. And no. Moreover, a defeated gladiator could ask for mercy. To do this, he simply had to raise his index finger. To grant him life or not was decided by the editor. Actually, the investor, owner, businessman, and sometimes even the emperor himself. The usual decision was made based on the crowd's opinion. If liked, saved. It is believed that the thumb raised meant life, and the lowered one death. But in reality, historians do not have a unified opinion on this matter. Perhaps life was indicated by a raised right hand, clenched into a fist, kind of a sword in a scabbard, and death just an extended hand and an outstretched thumb, symbolizing a bare sword. If a death sentence was nevertheless passed, the gladiator had to kneel and accept death. The skeletons of gladiators with traces of stab wounds have been found, inflicted by a sword from top to bottom, through the shoulder blade directly into the heart. Gladiators lived and trained in schools specially created for this. They could be private and later imperial. The slave gladiators were bought there by a Lanista, who also trained them and was a coach, and then rented them to an editor, who already organized games at his own expense. Essentially, he was the equivalent of a modern producer. During the Republic times, gladiators imitated Rome's enemies: Samnites, Gauls, Thracians. We don't know the exact weapons of the Samnites at all. They disappeared even before the establishment of the empire. The Gauls and Thracians continued to exist, but in a slightly altered form. The Gauls transformed into murmillos, which closely resembled legionnaires. A scutum, short gladius, all just like a Roman soldier. Take a look. The link is in the description. Thracians were easy to recognize by the high crest on the helmet, most often with the image of a griffin. In the era of the empire, a visor appeared on the helmet. On their right hand they had a manica, in the left a small rectangular shield parma. On their legs were greaves, weapon, short sword. Thracians were often confused with hoplomachus, but the differences were real. The hoplomachus didn't have a griffin on their helmet. The shield was often round, not rectangular, although also small. They used not only a sword, but also a spear as a weapon, but someone who could not be confused with anyone else was a new type of gladiator of the Empire period, the retiarius. Their armor was a metal shoulder guard galeris, worn on the left shoulder and also covering the neck, and a manica, also on the left hand. Their weapons were a 3-meter diameter net and a trident, just like Aquaman. By the way, in the framed Spartacus hoplomachus fights with retiarius, which could happen, but rarely. But the main opponent of the retiarius was another type of gladiator, the secutor. By the way, Emperor Commodus appeared in the arena as a secutor. They were similar, like the murmillos, to the legionnaires. But the only difference was their oval-shaped helmet. It didn't have a visor, so it wouldn't get caught in the opponent's net. But the main goal of the secutor was to avoid getting caught in the net and pin the retiarius to the ground with their armor. Another type of gladiator was the provocators. It is believed that these were criminals condemned to death. They tried to fight almost exclusively among themselves. The provocator's armor consisted of a manica on the left hand, a short greave on the left leg, a rectangular chest plate, a helmet, and a shield, slightly smaller than the scutum. The weapon was a straight-bladed sword. There were other types of gladiators as well, such as the Andabeti. They fought in a helmet with no eye slits, really blindly. However, it seems that by the time of the Empire they had already disappeared. There were also equestrian gladiators, equites, and gladiators on chariots, Esidarii, Sagittarii armed with a bow, Dimachari with 2 swords or daggers, cestus boxers, heavily armed Crupillarii and Lorica segmentata, and others. The public, like you and me, didn't really understand the types of gladiators. People just liked either big shields or small ones. Even emperors were divided on this principle. By the way, how long do you think we would last in the arena? Write in the comments. Subscribe, like. Good luck to everyone.